Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry had gone no more than a few steps along the lane when they encountered the first visible sign that St. Mary Mead had already begun rearranging the event to suit itself. Mrs. Hart, her basket hooked firmly over one arm, stood in her garden, pretending to examine a rose bush that had finished flowering weeks ago. Her head lifted at precisely the right moment. "Well," she said with the careful neutrality of a woman who intended her curiosity to sound like concern. "I suppose it's true, then." Mrs. Bantry halted at once. "What is?" Mrs. Hart leaned closer to the low hedge, lowering her voice while ensuring it carried perfectly. "About the doctor. Poor man. I always said he worked too hard. And yet," she paused meaningfully, "some people bring trouble upon themselves." Miss Marple noticed the way Mrs. Hart's eyes flicked, not toward Mrs. Bantry, but toward the doctor's house, as though guilt itself might be visible from a distance. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "People do say many things." Mrs. Hart brightened. "They do, don't they? And often for good reason." She hesitated, then added, "I saw someone there last night, you know." Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. "You did?" "Well, not there exactly. On the lane. A woman." Mrs. Hart smiled thinly. "Walking very quickly." Miss Marple nodded. "Women often walk quickly when they wish to arrive somewhere." Mrs. Hart blinked, faintly disappointed. Still, it was late. Mrs. Bantry was already bristling. "What time is late?" "Emily, oh, after 10, Mrs. Hart said. "Quite improper, I'd say." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Thank you for telling us." Mrs. Hart watched them move on, visibly unsatisfied, and Miss Marple reflected, not for the first time, on how disappointment followed so closely behind gossip when it failed to produce immediate conclusion. As they approached the doctor's gate, the air seemed to change. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but Miss Marple had felt it before in other villages, other houses. The sense that a familiar place had quietly withdrawn its worker. Two bicycles leaned against a low stone wall. Constable Miller stood nearby, his cap slightly crooked, attempting to look both official and unobtrusive. He straightened when he saw Mrs. Bantry. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, glancing uncertainly at Miss Marple. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied, smiling as though policemen were something she encountered every day, which of course she often did. The front door of the house stood ajar. Inside, voices murmured in subdued tones. Miss Marple could smell Polish, stale tobacco, and beneath it all the sharp, unmistakable edge of antiseptic. Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then squared her shoulders and stepped inside. Miss Marple followed at her own pace. The hall was crowded in that peculiar way only tragedy manages too many bodies attempting to appear as though they had every right to be there. Mrs. Denton stood near the stairs, her eyes red, her mouth compressed into a line that suggested both grief and grievance. She was explaining something for the third time to Dr. Haydock, who listened with professional patience and faint irritation. Inspector Slack stood apart, notebook in hand, his expression already hinting that he had formed an opinion and saw no reason to complicate it. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, unnoticed, which suited her perfectly. "Yes," Mrs. Denton was saying, "I always bring his breakfast at 8. Always. He liked his egg boiled exactly 3 minutes, and when I knocked there was no answer." Inspector Slack made a note. "And the door?" "Locked," Mrs. Denton said, "from the inside." "Had that happened before?" "No," she said sharply. "Never." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "He was dead some hours before you arrived." Mrs. Denton pressed a hand to her mouth. He didn't say anything, no complaints. Only well he had been unsettled. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the consulting room door, now open. The desk within was neat, almost aggressively so. The medical bag sat open, its contents carefully arranged, too carefully, Miss Marple thought, as though someone had wanted it to look exactly right. Inspector Slack followed her line of sight. "You've been in there?" "Yes," said Dr. Haydock. "There's no sign of a struggle, no sign of anything," Slack agreed. "Which usually means someone wanted it that way." Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "They're already convinced it's poison," she whispered. Miss Marple murmured, "Poison is very popular. It saves people from untidy emotions." At that moment a soft sound came from the hallway, a barely audible intake of breath. Miss Marple turned. Lillian Voss stood near the back door, pale, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked not at the men, nor at Mrs. Denton, but at the consulting room. Her gaze lingered there, flickered briefly to the desk, and then dropped. Inspector Slack noticed her at last. "Miss Voss, is it?" She nodded. "Yes. You were acquainted with Dr. Hargreaves?" "Yes. How well?" "Well enough," she said carefully. "Were you here last night?" There was a pause. "Not long, but long enough." "Yes," Lillian said. "I came by to speak with him." "At what time?" "After 9. Mrs. Denton made a small, sharp sound. Inspector Slack's pen hovered. "And did you leave him alive?" Lillian lifted her head. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Yes." Miss Marple watched her closely. Not the words, those were easy enough, but the way her fingers pressed together, as though restraining something that wanted to escape. "And what was the nature of this visit?" Slack asked. Lillian hesitated. "Personal." Slack's expression hardened. "That may become relevant." Miss Marple moved a step closer, her presence still quiet, still unremarkable. "Doctors are often visited for personal reasons," she said mildly, "especially by those who have been unwell for a long time." Lillian's eyes flicked to her quick, searching, and for the first time something like relief passed across her face. Inspector Slack frowned. "And you are?" "Jane Marple," she said pleasantly. "I live across the lane." Slack grunted, unimpressed, and turned back to his notes. Miss Marple let her gaze wander once more over the consulting room. Her eyes settled on a small detail, a chair pulled slightly away from the desk, angled as though someone had risen abruptly or been asked to. The world, Miss Marple reflected, was full of people who knew how to hurt others without ever raising their voices, and Dr. Edwin Hargreaves, who had healed so many bodies, might have left behind something far more dangerous than illness. The consulting room did not invite lingering, yet nearly everyone present found a reason to remain within sight of it. Miss Marple observed this with quiet interest as the small crowd shifted and resettled itself, each person edging just close enough to feel included while maintaining a careful distance from the reality of death. Inspector Slack cleared his throat and announced that statements would be taken one by one. The room responded at once. Mrs. Denton stiffened with proprietorial importance. Mrs. Bantry bristled at being excluded from information she already considered hers, and Constable Miller adopted an expression of earnest alarm, as though worried he might be asked a question. Miss Marple drifted toward a side table where medical pamphlets lay in orderly stacks. No one paid her the slightest attention. She leafed through one idly, though her real interest lay in the rhythms of speech. Behind her the rise and fall of voices, the places where words caught. Mrs. Denton spoke first. Her story grew more elaborate with each repetition. She emphasized her devotion to her cousin's household, the irregular hours she endured, the burden of caring for a man who, she implied, had grown difficult. Miss Marple noted how often Mrs. Denton returned to this theme, polishing it like a stone she wished others to admire. Dr. Haydock followed, brisk and professional. He spoke of time of death, of the vial and syringe, of the absence of any obvious poison residue. It may have been something he had access to himself, he said. Doctors do. Yes, Inspector Slack replied. That's what worries me. When it came time for Lillian Voss to speak again, she did so quietly, answering only what was asked. She did not embellish, did not protest, did not attempt to defend herself. Miss Marple noticed how this restraint seemed to irritate Inspector Slack more than any outburst might have done. You say your visit was personal, Slack said again. Yes. And you won't explain. Lillian met his gaze. Not unless it's necessary. Slack's pen tapped sharply against the notebook. We'll decide what's necessary. Miss Marple thought of several women she had known who behaved in just this way, who believed that dignity lay in withholding rather than confessing. It was a dangerous habit, particularly in villages. At last, the inspector announced that the house would be sealed for the time being. The gathering dispersed reluctantly, like children sent away from a firework display before the final explosion. Outside, the lane buzzed with contained excitement. People lingered in small knots, speaking in low voices that rose the moment someone new approached. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked slowly toward the gate. Well, Mrs. Bantry said, exhaling, that was dreadful and fascinating. Did you see how she answered him? As good as an admission, if you ask me. Did you think so? Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Bantry looked at her sharply. Didn't you? Miss Marple smiled. I thought she answered exactly like someone who had decided not to be bullied. Mrs. Bantry sniffed. That's a generous interpretation. It usually is, Miss Marple said. They had nearly reached the lane when Miss Marple paused. Dolly, would you mind terribly if I stayed a moment longer? Mrs. Bantry hesitated. What for? I believe I dropped my handkerchief, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Bantry looked doubtful, but was already being intercepted by Mrs. Hart, who had materialized with astonishing speed. Miss Marple slipped back inside unnoticed. The house felt emptier now, stripped of performance. In the consulting room, the light slanted across the desk, catching the edge of the open medical bag. Miss Marple approached it slowly. She did not touch anything. She rarely needed to. Her eyes moved instead to the wastebasket beside the desk. Inside lay a crumpled sheet of paper, half hidden beneath other scraps. Miss Marple leaned closer. The handwriting was hurried, the words partially obscured, but one phrase stood out clearly. I can't continue like this. Miss Marple straightened. People rarely wrote such things without meaning them. A faint sound reached her ears, a footstep in the hall. Miss Marple turned just as Mrs. Denton appeared in the doorway. Oh, Mrs. Denton said sharply. You startled me. I'm sorry, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I thought I'd misplaced something. Mrs. Denton's eyes flicked to the desk, then to the wastebasket. The inspector said no one was to disturb anything. Of course, Miss Marple replied. I wouldn't dream of it. Mrs. Denton hesitated, then said, with forced lightness, he was under a great deal of strain, you know. Edwin, people think doctors are immune to such things. Yes, Miss Marple said. People think many things. Mrs. Denton flushed. If he did something foolish, well, it wouldn't surprise me. Miss Marple met her gaze. Wouldn't it? There was a moment, a flicker of something unreadable before Mrs. Denton turned away. You should go, she said curtly. Miss Marple obeyed at once. Outside, the village seemed louder now, as though relieved to be allowed to speak freely again. Mrs. Bantry caught up with her at the corner. Jane, she said eagerly, you'll never guess what Mrs. Price Ridley just told me. Miss Marple listened politely, but her mind had already moved ahead, fitting small pieces together. A doctor under strain, a personal visit, a locked door, a sentence thrown away but not destroyed, and a village that had already decided it knew the answer. Miss Marple walked on, her expression serene, her thoughts anything but. Miss Marple slept badly that night, which she always regarded as a useful sign. It meant that her mind had not finished its work and refused to be soothed by routine. Long after the village had settled into darkness, she lay listening to the familiar sounds of St. Mary Mead, the distant closing of a gate, the bark of a dog answering a dream, the wind brushing against the hedges like a restless visitor. By morning, the house across the lane was quiet again, but it was the heavy, expectant quiet that followed disturbance rather than preceded it. Miss Marple rose early and took her tea by the window, watching as Inspector Slack's car reappeared, followed shortly by a second vehicle she did not recognize. The doctor's house, it seemed, had become an attraction. Mrs. Bantry arrived before 10, brimming with news and barely containing herself long enough to remove her hat. They're calling it suspicious now, she announced, accepting a cup of tea she had not requested. Slack says he's not satisfied with the suicide angle. Apparently the vial contained something that shouldn't have been administered in. That dosage something Dr. Hargreaves would have known better than to use. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Knowledge doesn't always prevent mistakes. Yes, but it does prevent certain kinds of mistakes, Mrs. Bantry said triumphantly. And there's more. The ledger's still missing. Miss Marple looked up. Still? Yes. They searched the house properly this time. Every drawer, every cupboard. It's gone. Miss Marple nodded slowly. People rarely steal what has no value to them. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Exactly. Which means it must have had value to someone. Or danger, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Danger? Records have a way of preserving inconvenient truths, Miss Marple replied. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, whose entrance into any situation carried with it a sense of grievance, as though she had arrived late to something she deserved to control. "I thought I might find you both here," she said, eyes darting meaningfully between them. "One has to be careful these days. You never know who might be listening." Miss Marple smiled. "Do sit down." Mrs. Price Ridley did so, lowering her voice immediately. "I've been thinking about Dr. Hargreaves. He wasn't the man people thought." Mrs. Bantry's eyes shone. "Oh? He had favorites," Mrs. Price Ridley said firmly, "and enemies. People he refused to treat further. Said they were wasting his time." Miss Marple considered this. "Doctors do sometimes grow impatient." "Well, he was impatient with my cousin Harold," Mrs. Price Ridley continued. "Told him there was nothing wrong when there quite clearly was. Harold went to another doctor and improved at once." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That must have been gratifying." "It was infuriating," Mrs. Price Ridley corrected, "and Harold never forgave him." Mrs. Bantry glanced at Miss Marple, eyebrows raised. "And where was your cousin last night?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. "At home, naturally." Miss Marple nodded naturally. Mrs. Price Ridley rose, dissatisfied with the lack of reaction she had produced, departed after a few more pointed remarks about incompetence in the medical profession. Mrs. Bantry waited until the door closed. "Jane, do you think everyone in this village had a reason to dislike him?" Miss Marple considered. "Dislike is common, motive is rarer." Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way toward Dower Cottage. The path was narrow and bordered by hedges that had been trimmed with unnecessary severity. Lillian Voss opened the door almost at once, as though she had been expecting the knock. "Miss Marple," she said, surprise quickly giving way to relief. "Please come in." The cottage was neat but sparsely furnished. A single vase of flowers sat on the table, their stems cut too short, as though arranged in haste. "I hope you don't mind my calling," Miss Marple said. "I thought you might appreciate some company." Lillian smiled faintly. "That's very kind." They sat. For a moment neither spoke. "You were very composed yesterday," Miss Marple said at last. "Not everyone manages that under pressure." Lillian looked down at her hands. "I didn't feel composed." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you behaved as though you had something to protect." Lillian hesitated. "I did." Miss Marple waited. "At one time," Lillian said quietly, "Dr. Hargreaves helped me, truly helped me, when no one else would." Miss Marple nodded. "And later?" "Later," Lillian said, her voice tightening, "he began to use that help as leverage." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That happens too." "He wanted me to stay silent," Lillian continued, "about certain treatments, certain patients." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Patients who appeared in his ledger." Lillian looked up sharply. "You know about that?" "I know it's missing," Miss Marple said, "and that missing things are often hidden rather than lost." Lillian's hands clenched. "I didn't take it." "I didn't think you had," Miss Marple said. Lillian exhaled slowly. "I went to him last night to tell him I was leaving the village, that I wouldn't be controlled anymore." "And how did he respond?" "He laughed," Lillian said. "And then he said something that frightened me." Miss Marple waited. "He said no one ever leaves cleanly. Not when there are records." Miss Marple nodded. "And after that I left," Lillian said. "I swear it." Miss Marple rose. "I believe you. At the door she paused. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, do tell me." As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected that power, once tasted, was rarely surrendered willingly, and Dr. Edwin Hargreaves had possessed a great deal of it. The question, she thought, was who had finally decided to take it from him. By midday, St. Mary Mead had achieved the brittle calm that followed, excitement when it threatened to tip into something less respectable. Curtains twitched with less enthusiasm. Conversations dropped more readily into murmurs, and even the postman moved with exaggerated neutrality, as though speed itself might be construed as interest. Miss Marple spent the morning doing precisely what was expected of her. She wrote a letter to a distant cousin, dusted the mantel, and sat for a time with her knitting in full view of the front window. It was astonishing how often people forgot that observation worked both ways. Shortly after noon, Dr. Haydock crossed the lane and rang her bell. He looked faintly ill at ease, which Miss Marple found encouraging. Men who were too comfortable rarely noticed what mattered. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, accepting the chair she indicated. "Inspector Slack suggested I might speak with you." "Did he?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "That was thoughtful of him." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "He thinks you notice things." Miss Marple smiled. "Villages are made of habits, Doctor. Habits are easier to see than people imagine." Dr. Haydock hesitated, then said, "I'm troubled by the medical aspects of the case." "Troubled in what way?" "The substance in the vial," he said. "It's not something Edwin would have administered to himself casually, not in that quantity. It would have required preparation." Miss Marple nodded. "Preparation suggests intention." "Yes. But whose?" Dr. Haydock leaned forward. The syringe bore his fingerprints only. The door was locked. There were no signs of coercion, and yet Miss Marple said gently, "You don't believe he intended to die?" Dr. Haydock looked startled. "No, I don't." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I once knew a woman who baked a cake every Sunday," she said. "One week she added salt instead of sugar. Everyone said it was an accident, but she had labeled jars herself." Dr. Haydock frowned. "You think?" "I think doctors, like everyone else, know what they are doing when it matters most," Miss Marple said. "And if Dr. Hargreaves made a mistake, we must ask why." Dr. Haydock rose, unsettled but thoughtful, and took his leave. That afternoon, Inspector Slack summoned several villagers back to the doctor's house. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her presence once again overlooked. She took a seat near the window as the inspector questioned Mrs. Denton anew. "You had access to the consulting room," Slack said. "Of course," Mrs. Denton replied stiffly. "I cleaned it. And the medical supplies." "Yes. Under instruction." "Did you ever administer injections?" Mrs. Denton hesitated. "Occasionally." Miss Marple observed the hesitation with interest. It was not the hesitation of guilt, but of resentment of someone recalling a task they had disliked being asked to perform. Inspector Slack pressed on. "And the ledger?" Mrs. Denton's lips thinned. "I don't know where it is. Did you ever read it?" "No." Miss Marple thought that was a pity. People who insisted too firmly upon ignorance often remembered more than they intended. When Lillian Voss was questioned again, her answers remained consistent. She did not waver, but she did grow weary, and Miss Marple saw how that weariness was being interpreted as strain. Afterward, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Denton in the narrow passageway. "You were very devoted to your cousin," Miss Marple said conversationally. Mrs. Denton sniffed. "Someone had to be, and difficult at times." Mrs. Denton stopped. "You didn't know him?" "I know the type," Miss Marple said gently. "People who hold knowledge over others often forget that knowledge cuts both ways." Mrs. Denton's face flushed. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple said. "Only observing." Mrs. Denton turned away abruptly. Later still, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Aldridge received her with visible relief. Tea was poured with unnecessary haste. "I don't like it, Jane," Mrs. Aldridge said, "all this suspicion. It's unsettling." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Truth often is." Mrs. Aldridge hesitated. "Dr. Hargreaves came to see my husband last week very late. Did he?" Miss Marple looked up. He seemed agitated. "Asked about parish records. Burials. Old ones." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did he say why?" "No, only that he needed to confirm something." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind quietly rearranging itself. By evening she returned home with a certainty that had not yet reached clarity. She sat again by her window as dusk fell, watching the doctor's house sink into shadow. Records. Ledgers, parish books, proof. She thought of the discarded note in the wastebasket. The phrase unfinished, but weighted with meaning. "I can't continue like this." Dr. Hargreaves had been trapped not by illness, but by consequences, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, had decided he should not be allowed to escape them. She picked up her knitting once more, her hands steady, her thoughts anything but. The rain began just after breakfast, thin at first, then with a persistence that suggested it intended to stay. Miss Marple welcomed it. Rain altered people's movements and moods. It made them pause, hurry, linger indoors when they might otherwise roam. Villages revealed different faces in wet weather. She was halfway through darning a sock when Mrs. Denton arrived unannounced and clearly agitated. Her coat was damp, her hat askew, and she did not wait to be invited to sit. "I thought you should know," she said abruptly. "They've been through the house again." Miss Marple set aside her sewing. "Have they?" "Yes." Inspector Slack and the constable. Turning out drawers, opening boxes, as if grief weren't enough. Mrs. Denton's mouth trembled, though whether from sorrow or anger was not immediately clear. "And did they find what they were looking for?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Denton hesitated a fraction too long. "No, of course not." Miss Marple nodded. "Then that must be very frustrating for them." Mrs. Denton's eyes darted to the window, where the rain traced thin lines down the glass. "They asked me about the parish records." Miss Marple looked up. "Did they?" "Yes. Wanted to know whether Edwin ever kept copies. As if doctors had time for such things." "Some do," Miss Marple said mildly, "especially those who like to be thorough." Mrs. Denton flushed. He was thorough. Miss Marple studied her quietly. "Were you ever frightened of him?" The question fell into the room like a dropped teacup, sudden, unavoidable. Mrs. Denton drew herself up. "Of course not." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then you were very fortunate." Mrs. Denton left soon after, clearly dissatisfied, and Miss Marple reflected that people rarely visited others unless they hoped to learn something or to ensure that something remained unknown. Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the church. The rain had driven most villagers indoors, leaving the nave cool and dim. She found the vicar, Mr. Aldridge, arranging papers near the lectern. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, relieved. "I was hoping you might call. I thought the church might be a quieter place to think," she replied. Mr. Aldridge nodded. "Quiet has been in short supply." They sat together in a pew, the echo of the rain against the stone walls creating a steady rhythm. "You mentioned that Dr. Hargreaves had asked about old burial records," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," the vicar replied, "from nearly 15 years ago." "That's quite specific," Miss Marple observed. "So I thought," Mr. Aldridge said. "He seemed particularly interested in death that had been reclassified." "Reclassified?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, illnesses that were later amended, mistaken diagnoses." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did you help him?" "I told him where the records were kept," Mr. Aldridge said. "But before he could return, he stopped, uncomfortable. Well, everything happened." Miss Marple thanked him and left the church with a growing sense of pattern. The rain had slowed to a mist, and as she passed the graveyard, she noted how many stones bore dates from the period the vicar had mentioned. That afternoon she encountered Inspector Slack outside the general store. He greeted her with reluctant politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, "you seem to be everywhere." She smiled. "It's a small village." He hesitated, then said, "You spoke to Lillian Voss yesterday. She's an interesting woman." "Interesting people often are," Miss Marple replied. Slack frowned. "She claims the doctor threatened her, that he had records that could ruin her." "And you doubt her?" "I doubt everyone," Slack said. But what bothers me is this: if Edwin Hargreaves was afraid of exposure, why didn't he destroy those records himself? Miss Marple considered. Perhaps because he needed them. Needed them for what? Control, Miss Marple said softly. People rarely give up their leverage willingly. Slack studied her for a moment, then shook his head. It's all very circumstantial. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Truth often is. That evening, as the rain finally ceased, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. A figure moved across the lane. Mrs. Denton again, this time heading toward the vicarage. She walked quickly, as though driven by necessity rather than choice. Miss Marple rose, took her coat, and followed at a discreet distance. She did not enter the vicarage, but she did not need to. Mrs. Denton's voice carried clearly through the open window. You mustn't let them look, Mrs. Denton was saying urgently. Those records, if they see them. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her heart beating steadily. Mrs. Denton emerged minutes later, her face pale, her movements hurried. She did not see Miss Marple. When the lane was quiet again, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts aligning at last. Dr. Edwin Hargreaves had not been the only one afraid of what the past might reveal. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was far more lethal than poison. The following morning dawned with an artificial brightness, the sort that followed prolonged rain and left everything looking newly scrubbed but faintly raw. Miss Marple noticed it at once. Such mornings had a way of encouraging people to be decisive, sometimes rashly so. She was finishing her breakfast when Constable Miller appeared at her door, his expression both apologetic and determined. Inspector Slack wondered if you might come by the station later, Miss Marple, he said. Just for a word. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course. The station was no more than 2 rooms and a narrow corridor, but it possessed the air of official gravity that made people speak more carefully than usual. Inspector Slack gestured for Miss Marple to sit. I won't waste your time, he said. We've located the ledger. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Have you? Yes. Hidden inside a hymn book at the vicarage. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That was a bold choice. Bold or foolish, Slack replied. Mrs. Denton claims she placed it there for safekeeping. Says she was frightened Edwin might destroy it. And do you believe her? Miss Marple asked. Slack hesitated. I believe she's frightened. I'm less certain of why. Miss Marple folded her hands. People who act for safekeeping usually announce it. Slack leaned back. The ledger contains records of experimental treatments, off-the-books dosages, patients who later died. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. And Dr. Hargreaves signed every entry. I imagine he did, Slack said grimly. But there are initials besides some of the later notes. Mrs. Denton's. Miss Marple opened her eyes. She assisted him. Yes. Administered injections. Altered records. And when Dr. Hargreaves began revisiting old files, Miss Marple said softly she knew exposure was coming. Slack frowned. You think she killed him? I think she feared him, Miss Marple replied. And fear is often the parent of desperation. Slack stood abruptly. Then explained the locked door. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Doctors value privacy. Locks are habits. Mrs. Denton knew his habits. Slack stared at her. He would have unlocked the door for her, Miss Marple continued, trusted her. He always did, and afterward she locked it again. From the inside. A simple thing with the right key. Slack exhaled slowly. The syringe, she prepared it, Miss Marple said. Not to kill him. Not at first. Only to sedate him. He was becoming volatile. Asking questions. But dosage is a dangerous thing when panic intervenes. Slack's mouth tightened. And Lillian Voss? A convenient distraction, Miss Marple said gently. Dr. Hargreaves enjoyed cultivating them. Slack was silent for a long moment. We'll need a confession, he said finally. Miss Marple rose. You'll have one. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Denton to tea. Mrs. Denton arrived stiffly, eyes darting, her manner defensive before a word had been spoken. I don't know why you wish to see me, she said, refusing cake. Miss Marple poured tea with care. I wanted to thank you. Mrs. Denton blinked. For what? For protecting the village, Miss Marple said. In your own way. Mrs. Denton stiffened. "I did nothing of the sort." Miss Marple met her gaze. "You believe that keeping the ledger hidden would spare everyone pain?" Mrs. Denton's lips trembled. "He was going to ruin us. All of us. Those people trusted him, and he betrayed that trust," Miss Marple said gently. "But hiding the truth only deepened the harm." Mrs. Denton's composure cracked. "He said he would leave me with it. Let them think it was my fault, that I had pushed the wrong dosage, that I was careless." "And that frightened you," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Mrs. Denton whispered. "I only meant to calm him. He was shouting, accusing me. She broke off, her hands shaking. "I didn't know it would stop his heart." Miss Marple reached across the table and covered Mrs. Denton's hand. "You knew enough." Tears spilled freely now. "I locked the door. I wanted it to look peaceful, like he'd chosen it." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "People like peace at the end." When Inspector Slack arrived later, Mrs. Denton went quietly. She did not protest. There was relief in her shoulders as she passed through the door. By evening, the village had begun its slow recalibration. Conversations softened. Certainties were adjusted. Guilt was redistributed in safer portions. Miss Marple sat once more by her window, knitting in the fading light. Across the lane, the doctor's house stood empty now, its curtains unpinned at last. Power, Miss Marple reflected, was a subtle poison. Administered slowly, it could convince good people they were acting for the greater good, and when it finally killed, it rarely did so alone. The removal of Mrs. Denton did not bring the relief St. Mary Mead expected. Instead, it produced a quieter, more unsettling mood, as though the village had exhaled too soon and now found the air thin. People who had spoken confidently the day before began to revise their opinions, softening judgments that had seemed firm only hours earlier. Miss Marple noticed this change most clearly in the way people avoided her eyes. She went about her errands as usual, but conversations faltered when she approached, and remarks that might once have been shared freely now remained unfinished. The truth, once glimpsed, had become uncomfortable company. Late that morning Lillian Voss called. She arrived pale but composed, her movements careful, as though afraid of breaking something invisible. "They told me," Lillian said once she had sat down, "about Mrs. Denton." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Lillian said quietly. "Relief, perhaps, or guilt, or fear. All three are very common in such circumstances," Miss Marple replied. "They tend to arrive together." Lillian clasped her hands. Inspector Slack apologized. He said I was never truly a suspect. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That was kind of him. Lillian looked at her intently. "You knew, didn't you? Before the others?" "I suspected," Miss Marple said. "Knowing is a dangerous word." Lillian hesitated. "Dr. Hargreaves, he wasn't always cruel. At first, he truly wanted to help." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "People rarely begin with harm in mind." "He changed," Lillian continued, slowly, as though power altered him. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. It often does. After Lillian left, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, something she had postponed while events unfolded. The path led her past the churchyard, where the rain had darkened the stones and softened their inscriptions. She paused by one particular grave, its date matching the period Dr. Hargreaves had been so keen to revisit. Mistaken diagnosis. It was a phrase she had heard many times before, usually spoken with regret but rarely examined further. In villages, as in families, error was often absorbed quietly, redistributed among those least able to object. That afternoon, Mrs. Bantry arrived in a state of subdued agitation. "I don't like it, Jane," she said at once. "People are pretending they never trusted him, or never doubted him. It's dishonest." Miss Marple smiled. "It's human." "Well, it's infuriating," Dolly said. "Mrs. Hart says she always felt there was something off about him." Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. "Did she?" "Yes, and Mrs. Price Ridley now insists she warned everyone years ago." Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "Memory is very accommodating," Mrs. Bantry sighed. "I suppose it will all settle down." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not quite as it was." That evening Inspector Slack paid a final visit. He looked tired, his confidence worn down by the realization that neat conclusions were rarely complete ones. "There's something else," he said, standing awkwardly by the mantel. "The parish records. Dr. Hargreaves had amended them before his death." Miss Marple looked up. "Amended?" "Yes, corrected diagnosis, restored original causes of death. He was planning to submit them formally." Miss Marple considered this. "So he intended to confess, or to shift blame," Slack said grimly. "It's difficult to say." Miss Marple nodded. "Intent is often the last thing we understand." Slack hesitated. "Do you think Mrs. Denton would have gone through with it if he'd given her time?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. "I think fear shortens people's horizons," she said at last. "It makes tomorrow feel unbearable." Slack exhaled. "That's what I'll put in my report. As much as I can, anyway." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat alone in the quiet house. The village sounds returned gradually, doors closing, footsteps fading, radio playing somewhere too loudly. Across the lane, the doctor's house was dark. She thought of the patients whose names had filled that ledger, of trust given and misused, of how easily authority could disguise harm when it wore the right coat. Later, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple paused at the window once more. The curtains across the lane fluttered slightly in the night air, unpinned now, empty of purpose. It struck her then that Dr. Hargreaves had never truly healed anyone in the way that mattered most. He had treated bodies, while neglecting the quieter damage he inflicted on minds and lives. And in the end, it had been someone closest to him, someone shaped by his habits, who had delivered the final, fatal consequence. Miss Marple turned away from the window and extinguished the light. The village would sleep more easily now, she knew, but sleep, like innocence, was never quite the same once broken. And somewhere beneath St. Mary Mead's carefully tended calm, the lesson would remain unspoken, but enduring that harm done in secret rarely stays there forever. The inquest was held 3 days later in the small municipal room adjoining the parish offices, a space ordinarily reserved for meetings about drainage and fate schedules. Miss Marple attended because it would have seemed peculiar not to, and because such occasions often revealed more in what was not said than in what was. Mrs. Denton sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, answering questions with a careful precision that suggested she had rehearsed each word. Her voice did not tremble, though her eyes did. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence plainly, stripping the matter of any unnecessary drama. Inspector Slack outlined the facts with professional restraint, avoiding embellishment, though Miss Marple noticed how he framed certain details so that inevitability rather than malice seemed the dominant force. The verdict was delivered without surprise. A murmur passed through the room, not relief exactly, but a collective adjustment, as though the village were rearranging furniture around a truth it could not move. Outside, small groups formed and dissolved. Some people lingered as if waiting for an afterword that never came. Miss Marple walked home alone. That afternoon, she received a letter written in a hand that was unfamiliar but precise. It was from a woman in the neighboring town, thanking her for ensuring that certain matters were finally set right. No details were given, but none were needed. Miss Marple placed the letter in her desk drawer and closed it quietly. Later still, she visited the church again. The vicar was there, seated alone, the parish records spread open before him. "I've been going through them," he said, looking up, "correcting what should have been corrected years ago." Miss Marple nodded. "It's never too late for accuracy." He smiled faintly. "Some families will be hurt." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not as hurt as they were by silence." As she left, she paused by the notice board. Already, the village announcements were reclaiming their space choir practice. A bring and buy sale, a reminder about hedges encroaching on the footpath. Life, Miss Marple reflected, was very good at reasserting itself. Mrs. Bantry came by that evening, her usual brightness tempered by something more reflective. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how close it all was, how easily it might have gone another way." Miss Marple poured tea. "It often does." Dolly frowned. If Mrs. Denton hadn't panicked, if Edwin had destroyed the ledger, if Lillian had spoken sooner. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "If." Dolly sighed. "Do you ever wish people would simply tell the truth from the beginning?" Miss Marple smiled. "If they did, villages would be very dull places." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Across the lane, workmen had begun airing the doctor's house. Windows stood open, and sunlight spilled into rooms that had long resisted it. Miss Marple watched as a chair was carried out and set on the pavement, its legs worn smooth by years of use. That night she dreamed of list names written and rewritten, some crossed out, some restored. She woke before dawn with the sense that something unfinished still lingered. By mid-morning she knew what it was. She made her way to Dower Cottage and found Lillian Voss packing books into a box. "I'm leaving," Lillian said simply. "Inspector Slack says there's no reason for me to stay." Miss Marple nodded. "You're very brave." Lillian looked up. "I don't feel brave." "Bravery," Miss Marple said, "is rarely a feeling." Lillian hesitated. "There's something I should tell you. The night I visited Dr. Hargreaves, he showed me a letter." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "What kind of letter?" "One he'd written but not sent," Lillian said. "A confession, not full but enough." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And what did you do?" "I told him to send it," Lillian said. "I told him it was the only way. And he laughed." Lillian said softly. "Said the village would never forgive him." Miss Marple nodded. "Villages forgive many things, but rarely hypocrisy." Lillian exhaled. "I thought it didn't matter anymore after what happened." "It does," Miss Marple said. "Truth has a habit of resurfacing." When Miss Marple returned home, she found Inspector Slack waiting at her gate. "I wanted to thank you," he said awkwardly, "and to say there may be further inquiries." Outside the village, Miss Marple smiled. "That is as it should be." Slack hesitated. "You think this isn't over?" "I think consequences rarely respect boundaries," Miss Marple replied. As evening fell, St. Mary Mead resumed its rhythms. The postman whistled. A child laughed somewhere behind a hedge. Supper smells drifted through open windows. Miss Marple sat once more by her own window, knitting in the soft light, and thought of Dr. Edwin Hargreaves, not as he had died, but as he had lived. A man who believed he could manage outcomes indefinitely, who mistook silence for consent. In the end, she reflected, it had not been justice that killed him, but the fear of it. And fear, once unleashed, was a very difficult thing to heal. The village meeting took place on a Thursday evening, called ostensibly to discuss the sum of fate, but understood by everyone to be something else entirely. Miss Marple attended because she always did, and because she knew that gatherings intended to move forward often revealed what people were still unwilling to leave behind. The hall filled quickly. Chairs scraped, voices overlapped, and the air grew warm with shared unease. The fate agenda lay neatly stacked on the front table, but no one reached for it. Instead, people waited, some with folded arms, others with expressions carefully arranged to suggest composure. Miss Marple took a seat near the aisle, her knitting in her bag. She had learned long ago that empty hands invited conversation, and tonight she wished to listen. Mrs. Hart spoke first, as she so often did, rising with a rustle of determination. "Well," she said, "I think we can all agree it's been a difficult time for St. Mary Mead." Murmurs of assent followed. "But difficult times," Mrs. Hart continued, "are best handled by looking ahead. Dwelling on unpleasantness does no one any good." Miss Marple noticed how several heads nodded quickly, while others remained still. Mrs. Price Ridley rose next, her voice sharper. "With respect, Emily, unpleasantness doesn't disappear just because we stop talking about it. People trusted Dr. Hargreaves." There was a shift then, a subtle tightening of the room. "He did his best," someone called out. "So did others," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "And yet mistakes were made." Miss Marple watched as blame moved invisibly through the hall, settling nowhere for long. It reminded her of the way cold air slipped beneath doors, finding every unguarded place. When the vicar finally stood, the room quieted. "We will not undo what has been done," he said gently, "but we can decide what kind of village we are afterward." Miss Marple approved of that. It was the sort of statement that asks something of people without accusing them outright. After the meeting, small groups formed as usual, conversations branching off into safer territories. Miss Marple slipped away unnoticed. At home, she found a letter waiting. This one bore the official stamp of a distant office and contained a brief acknowledgement. Further inquiries were underway. Certain files had been requested. Additional statements might be required. She folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the earlier one. The story, it seemed, was still traveling, only now beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead. The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Haydock arrived with visible hesitation, as though uncertain whether his presence was welcome. "I wanted to speak to you," he said once seated, "not as a doctor, as a man who missed something." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "We all do from time to time. I saw Edwin often," he continued. "I knew his temper, his pride, but I never imagined—" He stopped. "I assumed his competence meant safety." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Competence without conscience is a dangerous thing." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "I'll carry that with me." After he left, Miss Marple went to the window and watched the lane. The doctor's house was quieter now, emptied not just of furniture but of purpose. It would be sold, she supposed, eventually inhabited by someone who knew nothing of what had occurred there. That evening, Lillian Voss came to say goodbye. She looked lighter, Miss Marple thought, though the lightness was edged with resolve rather than ease. "I've found a position in another town," Lillian said. "It won't be simple work, but it will be honest." Miss Marple smiled. "That matters more than people realize." Lillian hesitated. "Do you think they'll ever understand? The patients' families, I mean." "Some will," Miss Marple said. "Others will prefer certainty to truth. Both are human responses." Lillian nodded. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Denton." "So do I," Miss Marple said quietly. "She thought she was protecting everyone," Lillian said, "including herself." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Fear often dresses itself as duty." They parted warmly, and Miss Marple felt the faint ache that accompanied every departure, a reminder that villages were not closed systems, no matter how they pretended otherwise. As night fell, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, knitting in the familiar rhythm that steadied her thoughts. Across the lane, the street lamp flickered on, illuminating the empty pavement. She thought of the phrase that had begun it all, the doctor who never healed. It struck her now that healing required more than treatment. It demanded humility, the willingness to admit error, and the courage to face consequence. Dr. Hargreaves had possessed knowledge in abundance, but lacked the patience to be wrong. And Mrs. Denton, capable, frightened, loyal beyond reason, had been drawn into his orbit until escape felt impossible. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and closed her eyes briefly. The village would remember this case for a long time, though never in quite the same way. Stories would shift, soften, rearrange themselves into something easier to live with. But beneath those stories, the truth would remain, as truths always did, quiet, persistent and waiting. When she rose to turn out the light, Miss Marple felt the familiar sense of completion approaching, though not yet arrived. There was one more reckoning to come, she knew, not in courts or records, but in the quieter aftermath that followed understanding. And in St. Mary Mead, such reckonings were rarely loud, but they were always thorough. The weeks that followed settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive gentleness. Summer advanced, as it always did, with roses opening where they were expected and hedges demanding attention at precisely the wrong moment. The village resumed its outward rhythms, and to a casual observer it might have seemed that nothing of consequence had truly occurred. Miss Marple knew better. She noticed it in the pauses that crept into conversation, in the way names were sometimes avoided, in how people now listened a fraction longer before speaking. The village had not forgotten. It had absorbed. One afternoon she received a final letter, this one addressed in Inspector Slack's careful hand. It was brief and factual. The wider inquiry had confirmed what the ledger suggested. Other records had surfaced elsewhere. Dr. Edwin Hargreaves's reputation would not survive intact, though discretion would temper public statements. Mrs. Denton had confessed fully. There would be no further need for Miss Marple's assistance. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in her drawer alongside the others. She did not feel satisfaction, only a mild, familiar weariness, the sort that followed a task completed without celebration. Later that day, she walked through the village green, where preparations for the postponed fete were finally underway. Bunting fluttered between posts, and Mrs. Hart was already issuing instructions with renewed authority. Children ran past, unconcerned with past tragedies, their laughter bright and unburdened. Miss Marple sat on a bench and watched. Mrs. Bantry joined her shortly, lowering herself with a sigh. "Well," she said, "life insists on going on, doesn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "it's one of its more relentless habits." Dolly was quiet for a moment. "I saw Mrs. Denton's sister yesterday. She's taking over the cottage. Says she wants a fresh start." "That's understandable," Miss Marple said. "I can't decide how I feel about it all," Dolly continued. "Pity, mostly, and a bit of anger. And if I'm honest, relief that it wasn't worse." Miss Marple nodded. "People rarely feel only one thing at a time." Dolly studied her. "And you? How do you feel?" Miss Marple considered. "I feel that truth, once acknowledged, has a way of changing the air, even when people pretend it hasn't." That evening Miss Marple returned to her house and sat once more by the front window, knitting in the fading light. Across the lane, the doctor's house stood newly occupied. A lamp glowed in the front room, and unfamiliar furniture cast unfamiliar shadows. She watched as a woman, young, brisk, unknown, closed the curtains without pinning them. Miss Marple reflected on how small habits betrayed so much. Pinned curtains, locked doors, carefully kept records, control masquerading as order, silence mistaken for peace. Dr. Hargreaves had believed that authority granted immunity, that knowledge once possessed could be managed indefinitely. He had healed bodies while wounding trust, and when faced with the consequences of his own decisions, he had chosen evasion over honesty. Mrs. Denton, shaped by years of proximity to that authority, had mistaken loyalty for responsibility. In trying to preserve the image of safety, she had destroyed what little remained of it. And the village, decent, observant, complicit in its own way, had been content to look away for as long as reassurance was provided. Miss Marple's needles paused. It was always so. Evil, when it appeared, was rarely theatrical. It was quiet, incremental, wrapped in routine and respectability. It grew in the space created when people chose not to ask difficult questions. She resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm steadying her thoughts. Later, as night settled fully over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed. She paused, as she often did, at the window for one last look at the lane. The village slept. Secure, unaware, changed. She thought again of the phrase that had so neatly captured the truth of it all, the doctor who never healed. Healing, she knew, required more than skill. It required humility, accountability, and the willingness to accept that harm once done must be faced, not hidden. St. Mary Mead would carry that lesson quietly. It would not speak of it often, but it would linger in memory, surfacing when trust was too easily given, when authority went unquestioned, when silence seemed preferable to truth. Miss Marple turned away from the window and climbed the stairs, her movements unhurried, her mind at rest at last. The mystery had ended, as mysteries always did, not with triumph, but with understanding. And understanding, Miss Marple reflected, was the closest thing to healing most people ever truly achieved.